lots of different names. The first name was the Roman name for York, which was Eboracum, which people will tell you means the place of the yew trees, but it's more likely to be the place of the boar. The Roman Empire collapsed, provinces like Britannia were abandoned, people flooded in from Europe, and at that point Angles and Saxons and Frisians and Jutes and Franks, lots of tribes from Europe came into Britain at that point. And it wasn't really an invasion, as people think, or as people say, it was just people moving around as they always have done. And York at that point became the Saxon capital of Northumbria, called Eofor. And Britain was divided into 7 kingdoms, like the Game of Thrones actually, and you get places like Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and York was the capital of Northumbria, and Northumbria was actually 2 counties added together, Bernia and Nisia. And then you get the Norse invasion of 866, Ivar the Boneless and his merry men, the good old Vikings, and that's when Eofor becomes Jorvik, and that's when you start getting your streets called Gate, and this is one of the streets called Gate, and this one's Gillygate, and it's named after a church, and the church is gone. And then you get the Norman invasion of 1066, and that's when York takes on its current name. And one of the main legacies of the Normans, really, apart from the castles here, of which there are 2, are monasteries, because they really founded monasticism, and York became a religious powerhouse, second only to Canterbury, and it still is, actually. Now, the church that gave its name to this street was called St Giles Church, and it was on the left, and there's a very grand red brick building there now, and it's the Salvation Army Citadel, and it's 1883, and the Salvation Army are a religious group who help the poor, and that was built as their headquarters, and they don't use it anymore. It's used by York City Church, but that's where St Giles's Church stood, and that disappeared in 1547. And York has got the best medieval churches, really, in this country. London had more, a lot of them were destroyed in the Great Fire. Norwich had loads, Canterbury had loads, Winchester had loads, but York's got more than any of those places, really. So it's still very high up in the hierarchy of the church. If you look over the door, when we move off, the keystone in that door, it says blood and fire. And that's the blood of Christ and the fire of the Holy Spirit, and that's kind of the motto of the Salvation Army. The General Booth actually laid a stone in there, and he was the boss, he was the main man in the Salvation, the Sally Army. They used to come around pubs actually, rattling tins, the Salvation Army. You don't see them anymore, I don't know why. Now this thing is a real mishmash of architecture. This is the Uni of St John. That's very modern, as you can see. It's actually a COVID testing centre, there's a little yellow sign just there. But the pretty bit is a bit further on, but if you look on the right here, you get a fantastic view of the walls, and you should get up there and walk around them. They are special, and I've walked around the walls in New York hundreds of times, and it's always brilliant and great fun. On the left, that looks like Henry VIII style, doesn't it? Mock Tudor. Well, it's Mock Tudor, but it's Victorian. It's 1844. And the blue plaque near the door on the right there, the round blue plaque, there's quite a lot of blue plaques that have appeared recently. And that one is to the Cruise sisters, who were pioneers of education for women in Victorian England. The Minster is on the right. The pointy thing is the chapter house where they have meetings. Behind that you've got the central tower. On the right you've got the bell towers. And on the left you've got the great east window. And sitting on the top of that, if you can see him, is St Peter. That's a fairly new statue to St Peter. The old one almost completely disappeared, it eroded away. That window there is the biggest medieval stained glass window in Europe, and it was put in between 1405 and 1408 by a chap from Coventry called Thornton, and it cost £56. And they've spent about 12 million fixing it. There was a church on the left, there are headstones everywhere. St Maurice's, gone, 1967, and on the right is the next city gate here, Monk Bar. Now if you walk down from Boothen Bar to Monk Bar, which is where we started to where we just passed, you are on top of Roman wall. The medieval wall that's there now, which is dated about 1300, is directly on top of Roman wall. It's buried under the embankment, and it was buried, we believe, by the Norse, who when they arrived in York, a lot of Roman wall was still here, but they put a rampart over the Roman wall and put a wooden palisade along the top of that, and that was subsequently replaced in stone bit by bit by bit through the years. On the left, fantastic garden, look at that. Little knot garden. And this is another street called Gate. Monk Gate, the street of the monks. And I talked about where York sits in the hierarchy of the church. And it was a monastic powerhouse, and it had at least 7 monasteries, and the most significant remains are where we were, behind the Art Gallery of St Mary's. And that was a massive abbey. It was nearly as big as York Minster, and it was Benedictine, and there were all sorts of different orders: Augustinian, Benedictine, Carmelite, Dominican, Franciscan and Gilbertine, and they were all in York. And the church had a tremendous amount of power, and everybody believed in heaven and God and hell and all this stuff, and it might be true, and one day we're all going to find out as well. But the church had huge power, probably more power than the monarchy. Over there on the left is Layerthorpe, which is quite sort of commercial industrial really. And on the left here you've got what looks like a canal, but is in fact the River Foss. It's York's second and smaller river, and it was turned into a canal in 1793 to try to control the flooding that's affected York for years. And if you'd have come down here in 2015, which you might have done, sir, this whole street was flooded. It was all underwater, and that's some of the worst flooding that we've ever had in York, in fact. And if you go in the King's Arms pub by the river, Ouse Bridge, they have all the flooding on the wall, and 2015 is at the top now, so it looks like it's been the worst that we've ever had. Now the city walls are on the right here, and they come to an abrupt halt. And you might think, well, where are they now? Obviously they're being knocked down. Well, they haven't, because they were never built. There's a big gap here. When they were building the walls 700 years ago, the area in front of us here, for about 120 yards, was a huge, great, impenetrable swamp. So they didn't try and build walls on it. They finish here at Dewberry on the right. They continue at the Red Tower, straight down the road, and it's built out of brick, and that's why it's called the Red Tower. It was actually a dynamite manufactory, or factory as we call them now. But the bit between that tower on our right and the Red Tower, which you can't see from here, underneath us, the river was dammed, and there was a massive moat here called the King's Fishpool, and a moat is a defensive piece of water basically, so it was created by diverting the river. So you had a huge great moat in front of us here, and it's not here anymore. And that's why there's a gap here. And if you read the information panels on the walls, and there's one on the right there, they'll help you understand things like this. And if you do the wall walk, when you're in bits where there's no wall or you can't get on the wall, there are little brass studs in the pavement with little castles on, and that's what they're for. Follow those round. That's the city trail, the defensive trail. That is St Cuthbert's Church on the right. Now I don't know if you know, but that's a good example of the typical orientation of churches in York, i.e. they are west-east, because they point to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is that away. It's no use looking, you can't see it from here. But churches typically are west-east, and so are Christian burials. Now you might not know that, but when you go home, go and look at your local church, and you'll find that the tower is at the west and the chancel is at the east. And you find the same with Christian burials traditionally. Your head is at the west, headstone, and your feet are at the east. And if you get north-south burials, they're almost always Jewish, and that's how the archaeologists discriminate. That particular church is redundant, which means it's not used for church services anymore. You might notice the name of the building on the left there, that's Defra, the King's Pool. And it gets its name from this great big moat that was behind us there, the King's Fishpool, and that's now disappeared. There's a really nice little garden down here, actually, on the right, just beyond the entrance to Arras, which is a fairly new restaurant. Pretentious was the word somebody used for, but I don't know, I've never eaten in there, but there's a lovely little garden behind it, and anybody can go and have a look in there if you want to do. It's open to the public. You can get right up to the walls. This is Peazone Green, and that's the Black Swan Pub on the left. Bowes House is its correct name. And they say it's 1417, and I say it's 1517. Now the basement, the cellars might be 1417, but York Archaeological Trust don't think it's as old as they claim it is, but it's a fantastic building. And Martin Bowes owned it, and he became Lord Mayor of London, actually. And General Wolfe of Quebec's mother, Henrietta, lived in there as well. Now this lot has been a community and it's gone. Hundgate, Haver Lane, Dundas Street, Carmelite Street, Garden Place, Pound Garth, the Haymarket. Terrace houses, very, very poor quality. infested with cholera, and the whole lot was condemned, and they started knocking the Hungate slums down in the 1930s, and it's been totally destroyed now. And they've started to redevelop with modern residential, which is fair enough. And it was a community, and there's actually a very good book about the Hungate slums, and it's called Rich in All But Money, because they were very, very poor people.